Hello everyone, this is chapter 1.2 and is the second lecture of a three-part lecture series. In this video we will look at Lewis structures. In the second video we will build on from this knowledge and consider formal charges, and in the third and final video we will look at resonance theory. So on this slide we're going to consider two Lewis structures, the first of which is hydrofluoric acid, which is a very simple structure. So hydrogen has one valence electron, it only needs one more in order to complete a duet, and this it can do by sharing that electron with fluorine, which also happens to need only one electron to fulfill its octet. So when these two atoms approach one another, they will bond, and the red dot and black dot are replaced by a single line to give us our hydrofluoric acid molecule. Now the next molecule is multivalent, and that means that there are atoms with more than one valence, so methanol. Now there are 6 steps for solving the Lewis structure for any multivalent or polyatomic ion. We'll talk about those now. So the first is to find the total number of valence electrons. So carbon has 4, oxygen has 6, and each hydrogen has 1. So that adds up to a total of 14 valence electrons, which is useful because it means that you look at the final structure you have and you should have no more than 14 electrons. The second is to find the number of electrons needed to make the atoms happy, in air quotes. So this is about fulfilling the duet and octet rule. The third step is to determine the number of bonds in the molecule. Well, carbon we know forms 4, oxygen forms 2, and hydrogen forms 1. The fourth step is to choose a central atom. Now, methanol, we are given the condensed structural formula for, so the carbon is the central atom as one of the hydrogens is bonded to the oxygen. Lastly, we would draw a skeletal structure. Now, we haven't done so in this case, but we will do so, in the on the next slide. And lastly, you place any electrons around the outside atoms. So let's continue on to the next slide where we do this for the acetone molecule. Total number of valence electrons. Now in this case each atom's valence electrons are provided. So we have 3 carbons, that's 12. 12 plus 6 is for oxygen. So that is 18, and 18 plus 6 is 24 valence electrons. The next thing is to find the number of electrons needed to make each atom happy. So carbon will need 4 electrons to attain an octet, oxygen requires 2, and hydrogen 1, and that is for it to attain the duet. Step 3 is to determine the number of bonds in the molecule. Carbon's going to form 4 bonds, oxygen 2, and each hydrogen forms 1. Now the last step, step 4, is to choose a central atom. So given the condensed formula, it's relatively easy to see that the second carbon will be the central carbon as it's in the middle of this structure. As the atoms begin to join up, try and keep the electrons as pairs. I have colour-coded them here to make it easier to visualise the shared pairs of electrons and the atoms involved. Currently, oxygen has only made 1 bond, but we're nearly there. Some of the atoms have full valence shells, so we'll draw them in as on the next slide. The central atoms, carbon and oxygen, have only 7 valence electrons. This is easily rectified as oxygen can share another electron, forming the 2 bonds it needs, and both atoms, carbon and oxygen, will have an octet. At this point, the pairs of electrons can be replaced by lines to provide the dash or displayed formula. Finally, it is possible to draw the complete dash structure if oxygen shares another electron. Draw the Lewis structure in the left box and draw the skeletal formula in the right box. Pause the video and resume when ready. After 5 seconds, the answers will be displayed. So this explains what we do when drawing a multivalent Lewis structure. However, what if we need to draw a Lewis structure for a polyatomic ion? Let's take a look on the next slide. When drawing the structure, you can survey each of the atoms and determine the total number of valence electrons as before. However, there is one slight nuance that we need to consider, and it's what to do with the charge. In order to approach this, we take one of the hydrogens and separate it out. So at the moment, boron has 3 valence electrons. Each hydrogen of the 3 has 1 valence electron, and we consider what to do with the last hydrogen on the next slide. Next, we add an electron to one of the hydrogen atoms. This is the main difference for drawing an atom of a polyatomic ion compared to drawing a neutral molecule. In this case, we add the electron to hydrogen because this is the most electronegative atom out of these 2 atoms. Remember that boron can only make 3 bonds as it has 3 valence electrons. The negative charge is spread over the entire polyatomic ion. To represent this, the square brackets are used as shown in the dot structure. However, because boron has an additional pair of electrons, this gives the boron atom a formal negative charge. We'll cover formal charge in the next few slides to make sense of this, but before we do this, let's now consider a positively charged cation. If we have a positive charge, that's a cation, we do the opposite. As before, we start with our neutral atoms. We now need to lose an electron to form a positive ion. The electron is removed from the more electropositive atom, in this case hydrogen. See if you can figure out what the Lewis structure looks like and write it in the box. Pause the video while you do this. As before, the positive charge is actually shared over the whole of the ion, but the formal charge requires the positive charge to be placed on an atom. We usually place the formal charge on the central atom. You should have covered formal charge in Modern Chem 1. We will review that concept in the next video. Now, a formal charge is the charge that's assigned to an atom in a molecule or in an ion. And what it assumes is that the electrons in all the chemical bonds are being shared equally between the atoms, regardless of their relative electronegativities. Now, we'll talk about how to calculate formal charges on the next few slides. But it's important to keep in mind that formal charges are just that, formal. Think of it as a bookkeeping method for electrons. The formal charge system keeps track of all the valence electrons that each atom brings with it when the molecule is formed. Now, the trouble with this convention is that the covalent sharing aspect of the bonding is overemphasized, such that we might get a distribution of electrons in a compound that does not accurately reflect the electron density. So, for example, we'll consider the molecule methyl lithium. Now, when we look at this, the atoms all have a formal charge of 0, but when we look at the bond polarity, we can see that there is a difference in regions of electron density, with more negative regions being coloured red and more electropositive regions coloured blue. This we could not glean just from the formal charges alone. However, if we break that bond between the methyl group and the lithium atom, the carbon then will have the negative charge. The negative charge has got to reside somewhere, and so this time the formal charge is placed on the carbon atom, and this corresponds very well with the map of electrostatic potential, which is essentially the same picture of electron density as when the carbon was bonded to lithium. Now, this is not to say that every neutral Lewis structure we draw contains atoms with formal charges of 0 either. Let's now consider ozone, a neutral molecule, and how to calculate the formal charges of its atoms. This slide represents a possible Lewis structure for ozone. A general rule, which will always apply on this course, is to try to reduce the number of charges in any structure we draw. The reason we do this is because any unnecessary separation of positive and negative charges costs energy, and thus we conclude that the lowest energy, that's the best structure, would minimize having any separated charges. Another way of saying this is that minimizing the number of formal charges in any molecule leads to the electrons being most evenly distributed about the different atomic centers in that molecule. Formal charges are calculated by the formula presented. Let's calculate the formal charge of the oxygen on the left-hand side of the molecule. Oxygen is in group 6 of the periodic table and has 6 valence electrons. From this, we subtract the 4 unshared or 2 lone pairs of electrons. From this, we finally subtract the bonded or shared electrons. However, this number is halved as the oxygen atom contributed only half of the number of electrons in the bond. Therefore, there are 2 shared bonded pairs of electrons, as indicated by the double bond. So we have 6 minus 4 minus half of 4. This gives the left-hand oxygen a formal charge of 0. Now let's calculate the charge of the oxygen of the central atom of ozone. The central atom also has 6 valence electrons, but this time there are only 2 unshared electrons to subtract. That's the 1 red lone pair. This gives 4. Lastly, we subtract half of the number of electrons shared. That means the central oxygen, which has a double bond and a single bond, contains 6 electrons in total, so half of 6 is 3. Therefore, overall, 4 minus 3 would give plus 1. Finally, let us now consider the oxygen atom on the right-hand side. The oxygen on the right-hand side, which also has 6 valence electrons, we subtract its unshared electrons. There are 3 lone pairs highlighted in green, so that's minus 6. This gives 0. Then you take away half the number of shared electrons. Seeing as the right-hand oxygen only has 1 bonded pair, this means there are 2 electrons, so half of 2 is 1, and that means that 0 minus 1 gives minus 1 as the formal charge on that right-hand side oxygen. Now that we have all of the formal charges for oxygen atoms in ozone, when we add them together, this will be equal to 0, and this is always the case for a neutral molecule. However, for a polyatomic ion, the formal charges, when added together at the end, will have the same magnitude of charge as is present on the polyatomic ion. On the next slide are some problems for you to complete. First, add any lone pairs of electrons when necessary to ensure that all the elements satisfy the octet rule. Think carefully about the boron atom. Then, calculate the formal charges on any atoms other than carbon or hydrogen. Note that all of the hydrogen atoms that are attached to heteroatoms have been drawn in if they are present. If we use the atoms provided and make a Lewis structure, we get a molecule called nitromethane. We would expect the nitrogen-oxygen double bond, which is 116 picometers, to be shorter than the nitrogen-oxygen single bond, which is 130 picometers. In Modern Chem 1, we rationalise that a double bond has a higher bond order than a single bond, and that there must be a greater force of attraction between these two atoms because they overlap better. This we correlated with having a higher bond energy, but I digress. You may remember from Modern Chem 1 that we could have drawn this structure differently. That is, we could have formed a second resonance structure. However, what evidence is there that this Lewis structure isn't correct by itself? When the measurements of the bonds are made between the nitrogen and oxygen atoms using either X-ray diffraction or microwave spectroscopy, the actual bond lengths between the nitrogen-oxygen atoms are identical. They are both 122 picometers. Furthermore, this measured nitrogen-oxygen bond length is intermediate. That is, it is shorter than the single nitrogen-oxygen bond, which is 130 picometers, but it is also longer than the nitrogen-oxygen bond, which is 116 picometers. Again, if we think back to Modern Chem 1, we learnt that we may need more than one Lewis structure to represent the bonding, and that each of the possible Lewis structures that we can draw is called a resonance structure. Lastly, the negative charge is no longer localized to one of the oxygen atoms. Rather, the negative charge is delocalized, spread out over the two oxygen atoms. Let's recap about resonance structures on the next slide. How can we show that the negative charge is delocalized? We can move arrows to draw different resonance structures. These arrows represent the movement of electron pairs. These electron pairs may have originated either from lone pairs on heteroatoms or from the pi bonds. In your mind's eye, you might be imagining something is happening like what is shown in the animation. However, that would suggest that these two Lewis structures are in some sort of equilibrium, whereby the negative charge is flip-flopping between the two structures. That is not the case. The double-headed arrow that is drawn between these two resonance structures is a construct that we place onto the atoms to give us a model of the bonding. Further, to show that these are resonance structures, we usually place them in square brackets. Neither of these two resonance structures by themselves can accurately depict the bonding in nitromethane. By recognizing that the negative charge is delocalized or spread out over the two oxygen atoms, we can draw a better representation of the bonding, which you also saw on the previous slide. These representations are called a resonance hybrid, and we use partial bonds, which are the dotted lines, to represent the partial double bond character of the nitrogen-oxygen bonds. This resolves the issue of the bond lengths being identical. Also, notice how the negative charge no longer belongs to either oxygen atom, rather the negative charge is delocalized over both oxygen atoms. This is the actual bonding and is called a resonance hybrid. Let's take a look at a different example. Just because individual resonance structures don't exist, they're still useful as they allow us to manually move electrons and see how bonds and or charges can be delocalized over a number of atoms. However, we have to be careful to remember that no single resonance structure provides the overall picture of bonding. Let's do a quick concept check. What might you predict about the carbon-carbon bond lengths and the positive charge of these two resonance structures? Pause the video and think about this. We would predict that the carbon-carbon bond lengths are identical and that they would be intermediate of the length of a carbon-carbon single and double bond. The positive charge would be delocalized or spread out over the free carbons. What does this look like in terms of a resonance hybrid? The resonance hybrid is what actually exists and depicts how partial double bonds are delocalized over the free carbon atoms. Also, the positive charge placed in the middle represents its delocalization over this carbocation. Are there any rules you have to follow when drawing these structures? Let's see on the next slide. Here's the first key rule that not only applies to drawing resonance structures, but also applies to reactions. We only move electrons. We never move the atoms. How do we show the movement of an electron pair? We use a curly arrow. The double-headed arrow moves electrons from regions of high electron density, starting at the tail, to regions of low electron density ending at the arrowhead. Let's see this in action. Here is a Lewis structure for the Ethanoate anion, complete with formal charges and lone pairs. If we want to push electrons in order to draw an alternative resonance structure, we need to think first about where are the pushable electrons, i.e. regions of high electron density that we can start our curly arrow from. There are a number of possible sources. Generally, lone pairs on neutral atoms or negatively charged ions are one source. Alternatively, a pi bond could also be a source of pushable electrons. Here we see a carbon-carbon double bond, but this could equally include a triple bond. Let's do another quick concept check. Why can't a single bond be used as a source of electrons? Pause the video and resume when you think you have an answer. One of the first rules of resonance theory is that atoms cannot move. If you break a single bond, the atoms will no longer be stationary. Once we've started moving the electrons from a source of high electron density, starting at the tail of the arrow, we need to move the pair of electrons to a receptor site or a sink. We use the head of the arrow to represent the intended receptor or sink. There are three possible sites that you can move a pair of electrons to. The first is towards a positive charge, as these will have empty p orbitals that are capable of accepting an electron pair. The second site is an electronegative atom. Electrons can move towards electronegative atoms typically when there is a pi bond adjacent. Lastly, you may be able to move a pair of electrons towards a bond of an adjacent atom if the atom after where you are moving the electrons to form a pi bond also have pushable electrons. This is going to require a bit of practice. Let's apply this to our Ethanoate anion and to a couple of other examples. I've seemingly drawn two sets of resonance structures, and they might look very different, but they actually represent the same thing. The top set are a 3D representation and include the p orbitals, because the p orbitals are where the electrons will be moving from and where they will be moving to. And so including these will prevent you from making mistakes in the first instance and breaking the most important rule that no atom in the second row of the periodic table is allowed to exceed an octet of electrons. However, it is perfectly valid for an atom in the second row to have an incomplete octet. If we look at the first attempt at moving electrons, this causes a problem. What is that problem? Pause the video and resume when you think you have an idea. If you said that the carbonyl carbon violates the octet rule, this is correct. Therefore, when we move electrons, we do so in stages until it is not possible to move them anymore, and we draw a resonance structure for each set of arrow movements. For example, when the carbon-oxygen pi bond is used as a source of pushable electrons, this is a valid move. The electrons are being placed onto a more electronegative atom that can accommodate the lone pair, a receptor. This results in the middle resonance structure. The one thing you should observe at this point is that the middle resonance structure has introduced two additional formal charges, a rule of resonance theory that helps you to decide how stable a resonance structure is or how much it contributes to the resonance hybrid seen at the bottom is to try to keep the number of formal charges to a minimum on any resonance structure. However, each structure you draw has to have the same net charge, in this case -1. The middle resonance structure is a minor resonance contributor because of the fact that we separated charge. Moreover, note how the carbon no longer has a complete octet. More stable resonance contributors are ones that have as many complete octets as possible around each atom. The last arrow movement is to take the lone pair, the pushable electrons of the middle structure, and to use this to reform the carbon-oxygen double bond and provides the third possible resonance structure. The receptor is the positive carbocation. Note that you only move the electrons that are in the same plane. Now this third resonance structure is degenerate. In other words, its stability is the same as the first resonance structure. Now why is that? Because if we think about it, the formal charges are on exactly the same atoms and it appears that the bonds have just switched places. So the next slide will provide us all of the information summarized on one slide with an example. I've summarized all of the ideas about resonance theory onto a single slide. So the first key rule is not to move any atoms. So that means you mustn't break any single bonds. When you move electrons using the curly arrows, those electrons that you move are typically going to be lone pairs or pi electrons. When you draw the resonance structure has to be a proper Lewis structure, so therefore you must not violate the octet rule for any of its atoms. All of the resonance structures that you draw have to have the same number of electrons, and if they have a net charge, then all of the resonance structures must have the same net charge as well. Now we have an example here for you to look at. The only valid way of moving the arrow is already shown. So any other movements would result in violating the octet rule. The other thing to note is that the resonance structures start off with no formal charges on any of the atoms. Therefore, the sum of any formal charges on any of the other resonance structures should also be equal to 0. When the electrons are moved onto the electronegative oxygen, just like the previous example, this creates an incomplete octet and introduces a formal charge. The final possible move is to move the electrons from the carbon-carbon double bond towards the carbocation. There are now no more possible moves. Notice how the positive charge is now on the terminal carbon. Unlike the previous two examples, we now have a set of resonance structures which are not equivalent or degenerate. Both resonance contributors B and C have the negative charges on the more electronegative atom, which is great. However, it is important to minimize the separation of formal charges. So therefore, in order of best to worst contributor, A is the best as there are no formal charges and each atom has a complete octet. This is the most stable resonance contributor. The next stable resonance contributor has the formal charges at the smallest separation. This is structure B. The worst contributor is contributor C, as this has the greatest separation of formal charges. On the next slide, we're going to take a look at a couple more examples. Here is an example question for you to complete. Using curved arrow notation, show how the electrons in the left structure move to produce the second resonance structure seen on the right. For this example, provide the resonance hybrid that reflects the overall bonding picture, including partial charges when necessary. In this example, the second resonance structure is a more important contributor to the resonance hybrid structure and thus the properties of the species. Explain why this is so. So pause, draw your annotations, draw the resonance hybrid and press play to resume the video. There are two reasons to explain why the resonance structure on the right is more important. First and most importantly, the structure on the left contains a carbon without a filled octet. This is very destabilizing. Second, recall that no molecule or atom in its right mind wants to be charged. The first resonance structure, the one on the left, has the destabilizing separation of charge. Moving the electrons to generate the second resonance structure on the right results in a molecule without any formal charges. Therefore, this structure will be a stronger contributor to the chemistry of the hybrid. This time we've used 2 arrows simultaneously. This was to avoid having to draw a resonance structure which introduces even more formal charges and would have been an insignificant contributor in any case. Therefore, if the atoms are in conjugation, now this means that there is an opportunity to move the electrons in an unimpeded manner, you can do so from the source to the sink using more than 1 arrow at a time. Please follow the instructions on the slide. The next video in this sequence will be video 1 of chapter 1.3. See you there.